Alien Girl's hypnotic pheromones work on everyone except the human commander. Stephen Clark stood at the observation deck of Nexus Station, hands clasped behind his back, as he surveyed the approaching diplomatic vessels. The massive space station orbited Proximus, and Tori B, serving as humanity's primary outpost in this sector and a neutral meeting ground for interstellar diplomacy, served the Emran delegation will dock. In approximately 15 minutes, Lieutenant Parker informed him, tablet in hand. The Galactic Council representatives are already in the reception hall. Stephen nodded, his expression betraying nothing, and our security protocols all in place, sir. Though I must remind you that the Emeraldian specifically requested minimal security presence during the negotiations. Requests noted and ignored. Stephen replied with a slight smirk. This station operates under human protocols. They can adapt by at 42. Stephen Clark was the picture of military discipline, 6'3" of solid muscle, shaved head, gleaming under the station lights, and piercing blue eyes that missed nothing his sleeveless formal uniform revealed. Arms corded with muscle, a deliberate choice that balanced protocol with psychological advantage. 15 years of diplomatic missions had taught him that physical presence could speak volumes before words were exchanged. Sir Parker hesitated. There are rumors about the Emerald and Representative Princess Ksyla. Stephen supplied. I've read the reports. Then you know about her abilities. Stephen turned, raising an eyebrow. Lieutenant, I've negotiated with telepaths, empaths, and beings that can manipulate gravity with their minds. Whatever trick the princess has up her sleeve, I'm prepared. What he didn't say was that ONI Office of Naval Intelligence had briefed him extensively on Princess Ksyla's unique biological capabilities. The Emeralds were known for their hypnotic pheromones, but the royal bloodline had reportedly perfected this trait to an art form. Princess Ksyla could supposedly bend the will of any sentient being with a simple exhalation. Any being except humans. Theoretically, something about human biology created a natural immunity, but this was untested information. No human diplomat had ever met Princess Ksyla directly until today. Princess Ksyla Deeren of the Emerald Aldean hegemony adjusted her ceremonial collar as her royal shuttle completed its docking sequence. The translucent material shimmered against her emerald skin, accentuating rather than concealing her natural attributes. Your Highness, her advisor Theus bowed slightly. I must again express concern about this meeting. The humans are unpredictable. They lack the proper respect for your abilities. Ksyla smiled, revealing teeth like polished pearls against the green of her lips. That's precisely what makes them interesting. Tell us, besides their immunity to our pheromones, is merely theoretical. No Emerald Royal has ever tested it directly, which is why your father, the Emperor, objected to your presence here. My father objects to everything I do, she replied, running slender fingers through her long silvery hair. But as heir to the throne, I need to understand all potential allies and threats the humans are expanding too quickly to ignore. At 28 cycles, Princess Ksyla had already built a reputation as a formidable diplomat. Her natural ability certainly helped. One controlled release of her pheromones could turn the most stubborn negotiator into a compliant admirer, but she prided herself on rarely needing to use this advantage. Her intellect was equally powerful. Still, she had never failed when she did deploy her biological gifts. Not once in 15 years of diplomatic service. The docking clamps engaged with a metallic thud. Shall I prepare the formal greeting? Theus asked. Ksyla's lips curved into a confident smile. No need. I believe I'll make quite the impression on my own. The reception hall of Nexus Station buzz with diplomatic activity. Representatives from 7 different species mingled cautiously, each maintaining their cultural protocols while attempting interspecies courtesy. Stephen stood near the entrance, flanked by 2 security officers. His posture was relaxed, but alert eyes constantly scanning the room. When the door slid open to reveal the Amalan delegation, even he couldn't prevent a momentary widening of his eyes. Princess Ksyla was stunning in a way that transcended to species. Her emerald skins seemed to glow from within, perfectly smooth and flawless. The formal attire of the Emeraldian royal house, a combination of flowing silver fabric in strategic transparency, left little to the imagination, while somehow maintaining regal dignity. Her silver hair cascaded down her back like liquid mercury, but it was her eyes that captured attention, large, almond-shaped, in a deep violet that seemed to shift colors as she moved Commander Clark. She greeted him, her voice melodic and slightly husky. How delightful to finally meet. Humanity's representative. Stephen bowed, slightly military precision in every movement. Princess Ksyla, welcome to Nexus Station. I trust your journey was comfortable as interstellar travel can be, she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach those remarkable eyes. She was studying him. He realized, assessing. Allow me to introduce you to the other delegates, he offered, gesturing toward the gathering. In a moment, perhaps, she said, stepping closer, I'd like to better understand the human who will be mediating these negotiations. Stephen maintained his professional smile, though his instincts flared in warning. Of course, Your Highness, though I should note that I represent humanity's interests rather than serving as a neutral mediator. Even better, she purred. And then it happened. Princess Ksyla took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. A faint green mist, so supple it might have been dismissed as a trick of light, emanated from her. The effect on the room was immediate. Every non-human delegate turned toward her, expression slackening. Even his own security officers straightened to attention, their eyes glazing lightly throughout the room. Conversations halted mid-sentence as all attention fixed on the Emeraldian princess, all except Stephen. He raised an eyebrow, watching with clinical interest as the phenomenon unfolded around him. When Ksyla's violet eyes returned to his face, expecting to find the same entranced expression, she saw everywhere else her composure cracked. Confusion flickered across her perfect features, quickly replaced by determination. She stepped closer, close enough that any other species would be overwhelmed by her presence, and exhaled again, more deliberately. The green mist thickened around them. Several delegates actually dropped to their knees in submission. Stephen simply smirked. Is there a problem with the environmental controls, Princess? Some sort of gas leak? Perhaps. Her eyes widened in genuine shock. Impossible, she whispered. Apparently not, he replied, maintaining eye contact. Now, shall we discuss the trade agreements, or would you prefer to continue this demonstration? For the first time in her diplomatic career, Princess Ksyla Darin found herself completely off balance. The human male before her, this Commander Clark, stood unaffected by pheromones that had literally brought other species to their knees. This is unexpected, she managed, struggling to regain her composure. I find diplomacy generally is, Stephen replied, his confidence unwavering. Shall we begin again, perhaps, with fewer atmospheric enhancements? Kyla's shock transformed into something else. Fascination. Yes, Commander, she said, a new respect in her voice. Let's begin again. Ksyla paced her private quarters aboard Next Station, her silver hair swishing with each sharp turn. The diplomatic reception had concluded hours ago, yet her mind remained fixated on Commander Clark's inexplicable immunity. It's simply not possible, she muttered, stopping to examine her reflection in the polished surface of the viewport. Her emerald skin glowed with agitation. No species has ever resisted royal pheromones. Fellis stood near the door, his own green complexion paler with concern. Perhaps the human has some artificial protection, a chemical countermeasure. I would have detected it, Ksyla replied, tapping her slender fingers against the viewport. My senses are attuned to such deceptions. She turned abruptly. Decision made. Arrange a private meeting with Commander Clark, claimant, to discuss the mineral rights clause. Your Highness thus hesitated. Is that wise? If he truly is immune, then I need to understand why she cut him off. This could change everything we thought we knew about humans. Theus bowed slightly, but his expression remained troubled. As you wish, but I must inform your father of this anomaly. Kyla's violet eyes narrowed that the Emperor need not concern himself with diplomatic minutiae. With respect, Princess, a species immune to our primary advantage, is hardly minutiae. Theus straightened his posture, the security implications alone. Very well, she conceded with obvious reluctance, but emphasized that I'm handling the situation. The last thing we need is my father overreacting and sending the royal guard after Phyllis. Departed Ksyla moved to her personal console and accessed the station's database on human physiology. The information was frustratingly limited. Humans were notoriously protective of their biological data. What she did find intrigued her further. Human olfactory systems were relatively primitive compared to most spacefaring species. Their brains processed chemical signals differently, and most interestingly, their mating behaviors were uniquely complex, combining biological imperatives with elaborate social rituals. Fascinating, she murmured, lingering on an anatomical diagram. Despite their external similarities to Emeraldian humans, were fundamentally different on a cellular level. Perhaps their immunity wasn't so surprising. After all, what was surprising was her own reaction to Commander Clark. She'd encountered resistance before. Some species required higher pheromone concentrations than others, but never complete immunity. The challenge he presented was stimulating in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her console chimed with a notification. Commander Clark had accepted her request for a private meeting scheduled for 900 station time. Silas smiled to herself. Tomorrow would be illuminating in his own quarters. Stephen reviewed the security footage from the reception. The green mist was barely visible on camera, but the effects were unmistakable. Every non-human in the room simultaneously entranced. Computer forward report to OI with priority. Classification. He instructed confirmation of M. Allen pheromone capabilities is described in intelligence briefing Alpha 73. The computer acknowledged with a soft chime. Stephen leaned back in his chair, considering his next move. Princess Ksyla's request for a private meeting was transparent in his motives, but potentially useful. The Emeraldian Himini controlled access to rare minerals essential for FTL drive components. Securing favorable terms was his primary mission. Her fascination with his immunity could be leveraged. His community buzzed with an incoming transmission, encrypted. OI priority. Channel Clark here. He answered. Admiral Jensen's weathered face appeared on screen. Commander, your preliminary report is concerning the Emeraldian abilities are more potent than we anticipated. Yes, sir, but our immunity hypothesis appears correct for now, Jensen replied grimly. But we can't assume it's universal to all humans or permanent. Your continued resistance is crucial to the negotiations. Stephen nodded. Understood, sir. There's more, Jensen continued. We've intercepted communications from the Emerald, and delegation their advisor is reporting your immunity directly to Emperor Dirin. Expected, Stephen replied. Princess Ksyla mentioned her father's protective tendencies. Protective is an understatement. Jensen snorted. Dine has eliminated political rivals for merely looking at his daughter inappropriately. A human immune to her control may be perceived as a threat or an opportunity. Steve countered. The princess seems more intrigued than alarmed. Jensen's eyes narrowed. Be careful, Commander. Your psychological profile indicates susceptibility to strong-willed women. Don't let conventional attraction cloud your judgment. Where pheromones fail, Stephen stiffened slightly. My personal history won't interfere with the mission, sir. See that it doesn't. Jensen out. The screen went dark, leaving Stephen with an uncomfortable realization. Jensen wasn't wrong. He did find the princess attractive, and not just physically. Her quick adaptation to his immunity, the sharp intelligence behind those violet eyes, these qualities appealed to him on a level no pheromone could reach. Dangerous territory for a diplomatic mission of this importance. The next morning, Ksyla prepared meticulously for her meeting meeting with Commander Clark, she selected a formal but flattering ensemble of form-fitting dress in deep purple that complemented her skin tone, with strategic cutouts that revealed glimpses of emerald flesh. Without being overtly provocative for this encounter, she would rely on more traditional methods of persuasion, and when she entered the private conference room, she found Stephen already waiting, reviewing documents on a data pad. He rose immediately, military precision in his movements. Princess Ksyla, he greeted her with a slight bow. "Thank you for suggesting this meeting, Commander Clark," she replied. Noting how his formal uniform accentuated his powerful physique, human military attire was utilitarian compared to emerald and regalia, yet somehow more effective for it. "I believe we have much to discuss beyond mineral rights." In his chin, he gestured to a chair, though I should note that this room is equipped with enhanced atmospheric filters. A smile played at her lips, precautionary standard procedure. He replied, his own smile equally measured for all diplomatic meetings, of course, she took the offered seat, crossing her legs deliberately. "Though I'm curious, would you have noticed if I tried again?" "Yes," he said, simply retaking his own seat had the question escaped. Before she could moderate her tone, Stephen considered her for a moment. "Your pheromones have a distinct scent to human, sweet, with an undertone like earth pine, after rain, pleasant actually, but noticeable." This was unexpected information. "You can smell them, but aren't affected." "Correct. Our neurological response is different. The compounds that trigger submission in other species simply don't connect to the same pathways in human brains." Ksyla leaned forward slightly. "Yet humans respond to each other's pheromones during mating rituals." A flicker of something amusement. Interest crossed his face. "We do, but subtly human attraction is more complex than chemical reactions alone." "How fascinating," she said, genuinely intrigued. "On my world, chemical compatibility is considered the foundation of all relationships, and yet you're here, negotiating trade agreements, rather than simply the compelling agreement." Stephen raised an eyebrow, suggesting you recognize the limitations of biology. Silas smiled aptly, appreciating his perception. "Pheromones create compliance, Commander, not creativity. For true collaboration, minds must engage freely." A surprisingly egalitarian view from a royal whose species is known for biological dominance. "Perhaps I'm not as ordinary as you thought," she replied, deliberately echoing his words from their first meeting for the first time. Stephen laughed, a warm, genuine sound that transformed his airn features. "Tush, Princess." Something shifted between them in that moment, a mutual recognition of worthy adversaries perhaps, or something more primal that neither was quite ready to acknowledge now. Silas said, straightening slightly, "Shall we discuss those mineral rights? I believe Earth's proposal undervalues the processing costs by at least 177%. "Interesting," Stephen replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Our analysis suggests the hegemon transport search charges are inflated by 23%. Ksyla felt a flutter of excitement that had nothing to do with diplomacy. This human challenged her in ways no one had before, without chemical advantages or loyal difference. For the first time in her life, she was engaging with someone who saw her not the pheromones or the title. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. The negotiations had progressed for nearly 2 hours when the first alarm sounded, a low, pulsing tone that immediately drew Stephen's attention away from the mineral rights discussion. "That's unusual," he murmured, rising from his seat and moving to the door console. Kay watched him with mild curiosity. "A drill? Perhaps we don't schedule drills during diplomatic meetings." His fingers danced across the console, bringing up station security protocols. His expression hardened. "Containment breach in the xenobiology lab, level 3 lockdown initiated." As if on cue, the lights dimmed to emergency settings and a computerized voice announced, "Attention all personnel. Biohazard containment protocol engaged. All sections sealed until decontamination is complete. Estimated time to resolution 4 hours 17 minutes." The door panel flashed red, indicating the magnetic locks had engaged well. Ksyla said, leaning back in her chair with surprising composure, "It seems our negotiations will be extended." Stephen tapped his combat Clark to Command Center. After a moment of static, a response came through. Commander, this is Lieutenant Parker. We have an accidental release of Jovian spore samples, non-lethal but protocol. Requires full containment until the filtration system can clear them. Casualties, none sir, just inconvenience. The station is compartmentalized, as designed. Keep me updated. Clark out. He turned to Ksyla, who was observing him with those remarkable violet eyes. It appears we're confined together for the next 4 hours, Princess. How fortunate that we have trade agreements to discuss. She replied with a slight smile. Stephen returned to his seat, but the formal atmosphere had already shifted. Being locked in a room together created an intimacy that diplomatic protocol couldn't quite contain. Perhaps we could use this time for something more productive than haggling over percentages, Silas suggested after a moment. Stephen raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? Cultural exchange, she said simply. I find myself curious about humans beyond what our databases provide, and given your immunity to my natural advantages, you represent a unique opportunity for unbiased insight. Fair enough, Stephen agreed, relaxing slightly. What would you like to know? Ksyla considered for a moment. Your mating rituals. They're remarkably complex compared to most species. Stephen nearly choked on the water he'd been drinking. That's direct. Have I violated a taboo? She asked, genuinely concerned. Emeraldian. Discuss reproductive biology. Quite openly. Not a taboo. Exactly, he recovered, setting down his glass. Just unexpected as a diplomatic conversation topic. Forgive me, she said, though her expression suggested more amusement than contrition. On my world, understanding reproductive compatibility is considered fundamental to any potential alliance. Stephen blinked. I don't believe Earth's treaty proposal included that particular form of alliance. Ksyla laughed, a melodic sound that transformed her regal features into something more approachable. I'm not proposing we mate, Commander, merely seeking to understand your species better. Of course, he replied, though he couldn't help noticing how the emergency lighting cast an entrenching glow on her emerald skin. What specifically about human relationships interests you? Your courtship behaviors seem unnecessarily complicated, she said, leaning forward. Emeraldian. Simply exchange chemical signatures to determine compatibility and then proceed to physical bonding if mutually agreeable. Humans value the journey as much as the destination. Stephen explained, finding himself drawn into the conversation despite its unusual nature. The uncertainty, the pursuit, these create emotional bonds beyond physical attraction. How inefficient, Ksyla mused, though her tone held fascination rather than judgment. Yet you've colonized dozens of worlds in a relatively short time. Your reproduction must be effective despite these complications. Stephen couldn't help but laugh. We manage, and what a pleasure, she asked, her violet eyes holding his gaze with unsettling directness. Aldean. Separate reproductive necessity from recreational coupling to humans makes similar distinctions. The temperature in the room seemed to rise several degrees. Stephen loosened his collar slightly. We do, he acknowledged, though our cultural attitudes toward casual physical relationships vary widely. And your personal attitude? Ksyla asked, her voice dropping to a more intimate register. Stephen considered his response carefully. This was dangerous territory for a diplomatic mission, yet the isolation and unexpected intimacy of their situation made professional distance increasingly difficult to maintain. I believe that physical connection should follow meaningful emotional connection, he said finally, though I recognize that's not universal among my species. Interesting, Sue replied, studying him with new appreciation that aligns more closely with emerald and royal tradition than common practice as heirs to biological power. We're taught to be selective with physical intimacy because of your pheromones. She nodded. They intensify during close encounters. Without proper control, partners can become permanently bonded, psychologically dependent. It's considered unethical to create such bonds casually. But I'm immune, Stephen observed, the implication hanging in the air between them. Yes, Ksyla acknowledged, her emerald complexion darkening slightly in what he recognized as the emerald and equivalent of a blush. "You are uniquely safe." The word carried weight beyond its simple meaning for someone who had lived her entire life cautious of her own biological impact on others. The freedom his immunity represented must be profound. "That must be a rare experience for you," he said softly. You cannot imagine," she replied, her usual composure slipping to reveal genuine vulnerability. "To interact without constantly monitoring my chemical output, without worrying about unintentional influence. It's liberating." Stephen found himself moved by her confession. "Is that why you requested this private meeting, to experience conversation without your pheromones affecting the outcome?" "Partly," she admitted, "though I was also genuinely curious about your immunity. No one has ever simply seen me before, just not the princess, not the pheromones." The honesty of her response created a shift in the atmosphere between them. What had begun as diplomatic maneuvering had transformed into something more authentic. "And what do you think of being seen?" he asked. Ksyla rose from her chair and moved to the viewport, gazing out at the stars. "It's terrifying," she confessed, "and exhilarating, like standing at a precipice knowing you could fall, but choosing to remain there anyway." Stephen joined her at the viewport, careful to maintain a respectful distance while still close enough to continue their conversation privately. "That's not so different from how humans approach relationships," he observed. "The vulnerability, the risk, they're part of what makes the connection meaningful." She turned to face him, and in the starlight her beauty transcended species. "Is that what's happening here, Commander? Are we forming a connection?" The professional part of Stephen's mind warned him to retreat, to re-establish diplomatic boundaries. Admiral Jensen's warning echoed in his thoughts, but standing there, seeing the genuine curiosity and tentative hope in her expression, he couldn't bring himself to deny the truth. "I believe we might be," he acknowledged quietly. Ksyla stepped closer, close enough that he could detect the subtle, sweet scent of her natural pheromones, pleasant but powerless over his human physiology. "Among my people," she said softly, "physical touch is how we confirm connections beyond chemical compatibility." She slowly extended her hand, palmed up, a gesture of invitation rather than demand. Stephen knew he stood at a crossroads. Taking her hand would acknowledge something beyond diplomacy, beyond their official roles. It would be a personal choice, uninfluenced by her pheromones, based solely on the genuine connection forming between them. He placed his hand in hers, the simple contact, and an unexpected current through him, not alien pheromones, but the basic human response to desired touch. Her skin was warmer than human temperature, silky smooth against his callous palm. "Your heart rate has increased," she observed, her sensitive fingers detecting the pulse at his wrist, "as has mine. Perhaps our biologies aren't so incompatible after all." The moment between Ksyla and Stephen deepened as they stood by the viewport. Hands still joined the stars, bearing silent witness to their unexpected connection. The diplomatic pretense had fallen away, leaving two beings from vastly different worlds, discovering something elemental between them. "Your temperature is fascinating," Ksyla murmured, her slender fingers exploring the contours of his hand. "Cooler than mine, yet somehow warming." Stephen found himself entranced by the subtle differences in her physiology, the slight luminescence of her emerald skin, the way her silver hair seemed to capture and reflect starlight. "Emerald and biology maintains a higher baseline temperature, doesn't it?" "Yes," she confirmed, moving imperceptibly closer. "Our metabolic rate is approximately 20% faster than yours. That's why we appear to glow slightly to human eyes. Excess energy radiating as visible light. It's beautiful," he admitted, the words escaping before diplomatic caution could intervene. Her violet eyes widened slightly at the compliment, then softened. "Humans have your own unique beauty, your resilience, your adaptability. They're reflected in your physical form." Their scientific exchange was merely a veneer over the growing attraction. Neither could deny. Each biological observation was an excuse to remain connected, to explore the differences and similarities between them. The moment might have progressed further had the communication panel not chimed with an incoming transmission. Ksyla reluctantly withdrew her hand. As Stephen moved to answer Commander Clark, he responded, his voice remarkably steady, despite the moment's interruption. Instead of the acted station personnel Theus, his concerned face appeared on screen. His eyes widened slightly at seeing Ksyla and Stephen standing so close together. Princess, he addressed Ksyla directly, ignoring protocol. I've been attempting to reach you. Your personal communicator appears to be inactive. The containment lockdown interferes with personal devices. She explained smoothly. What's so urgent, Theus? The advisor's expression tightened. I have received a direct communication from the Emperor. He's concerned about the situation on Nexus Station. Stephen noticed how Kyla's posture immediately stiffened, royal bearing replacing the more relaxed demeanor she'd shown moments before. What specifically concerns my father? She asked, her tone cooling several degrees. Reports of your failed influence attempt have reached him. Thelos replied, his eyes flicking briefly to Stephen. He's dispatched the Royal Guard to ensure your safety. My safety? Ksyla's voice rose slightly. I'm in no danger here. The Emperor believes otherwise. The human's immunity represents an unknown variable. The Guard will arrive within 12 hours to escort you back to the hegemony. Stephen watched the color drain from Silas's face, her emerald complexion paling to a mint shade. This is unacceptable, she stated firmly. I am conducting crucial negotiations. Tell my father. Princess Theus interrupted, a rare breach of protocol that indicated the seriousness of the situation. The Emperor was most insistent. Captain Vorex commands the detachment personally. At the mention of this name, Kiss composure faltered completely. Vorex. He's sending Vorex. Who is Captain Vorex? Stephen asked quietly. Ksyla ignored the question. Addressing Thelius with renewed authority, inform my father that I will contact him directly once this containment lockdown is lifted. Make it clear that I consider this intervention premature and potentially damaging to our diplomatic position. As you wished, Princess, though I doubt it will change his decision. Pelas bowed slightly before ending the transmission. The moment the screen went dark, Ksyla turned away, her hands clenched at her sides. Princess Stephen approached cautiously. Who is Captain Vorex? My father's most loyal enforcer, she replied without turning, and my former bet roded. The revelation hung in the air between them, adding a new complexity to their already complicated situation. I see, Stephen said carefully, and his arrival would complicate things. Ksyla laughed bitterly. Complicate? Vorex despises humans on principle. He considers your species barely civilized, and he's never forgiven me for breaking our arrangement. Why did you? The question was personal, perhaps too personal for their tenuous connection, but Stephen found himself needing to know. Ksyla finally turned to face him, vulnerability and defiance warring in her expression. Because even my pheromones could make him kind. He obeyed, but the cruelty remained in his eyes. She shook her head. I refused to spend my life with someone who saw my abilities as weapons rather than gifts. Before Stephen could respond, another alarm sounded, different from the containment breach alert, higher pitched and more urgent. What now? Sa asked, tension evident in her voice. Stephen moved quickly to the door console, accessing the security protocols. His expression grew concerned as he read the alert. The station's biometric securities system has detected unusual biological activity in this room, he explained. Specifically, elevated levels of an unidentified compound is categorizing as potentially hazardous. Realization dawned on Ksyla's face. My pheromone, she whispered, but I haven't deliberately released any since our first meeting. Could they be released unconsciously? Stephen asked, already suspecting the answer. The emerald hue of her skin darkened noticeably. Yeah, she admitted, during periods of a heightened emotional states. Particularly attraction. Stephen finished for her, their eyes meeting in mutual understanding. This is mortifying, Ksyla said, covering her face briefly. I haven't lost control of my emission since adolescence. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Stephen couldn't help but smile. "I'm flattered, you shouldn't be," she retorted, though a reluctant smile tugged at her lips. "It's highly inappropriate for a royal." The console chimed again, indicating an incoming communication. This time it was Lieutenant Parker from station. "Security Commander, our systems have detected an unknown biological compound in conference room 3. Protocol requires investigation. We're sending a security team to your location." "Negative, Lieutenant." Stephen replied quickly. "The compound is harmless and natural biological emission from Princess Ksyla's species. No investigation necessary." Parker hesitated. "Sir, protocol is clear about unidentified biological agents." "I'm overwriting protocol," Stephen stated firmly. "This is a diplomatic matter. Log it as a false alarm triggered by normal emerald biological functions." "Yes, Sir," Parker replied, though his tone suggested this explanation would generate questions. "Should I inform Admiral Jensen of this situation?" Stephen glanced at Tyler, who was watching him intently. "That won't be necessary, Lieutenant. I'll include it in my regular report." After ending the communication, Stephen turned to find Ksyla much closer than before, her violet eyes studying him with new intensity. "You just lied to protect me from embarrassment," she observed. "Why, I didn't lie," he corrected. "Your pheromones are harmless to humans, and they are natural biological emissions, a selective interpretation of the truth." She noted with a hint of admiration. "Very diplomatic." "I try," he replied with a slight smile. Their proximity was affecting him in ways that had nothing to do with alien pheromones. The warmth radiating from her skin, the subtle floral scent that was her natural essence rather than her chemical influence. "Your protection creates a problem. However," Ksyla said softly, "if my emotional state triggered this level of pheromone production, then continuing our previous conversation would likely trigger the alarm again." Stephen concluded precisely. Her gaze dropped briefly to his lips before returning to his eyes, "which leaves us with a dilemma." Stephen considered their situation: locked in a room for several more hours with growing attraction between them, biological alarms that would trigger with heightened emotion, and a royal guard en route to separate them permanently. "I see two options," he said finally. "We can return to discussing mineral rights and pretend the last hour never happened," or K prompted when he paused, "or we acknowledge what's happening between us and find a way to manage your biological responses." Her violet eyes widened slightly. "And how would we do that, Commander?" "Stephen," he corrected gently, "if we're discussing this, I think we're beyond titles." "Stephen," she repeated his name, sounding exotic in her melodic accent. "How would we manage my responses?" "Stephen," he stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the heat emanating from her skin on Earth. "There's an old saying about biological reactions, exposure therapy, meaning?" she asked, though her knowing smile suggested she understood perfectly. "Well-controlled exposure to stimuli eventually reduces the reactive response," he explained, his voice dropping lower. "Theoretically, if we explored this attraction in measured steps, your pheromone production might stabilize." Ksyla's silvery laughter filled the space between them. "That's the most clinical seduction I've ever encountered." "I'm a soldier, not a poet," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "No," she agreed, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with delicate fingers. "You're something far more dangerous." "The human who sees me clearly." The touch of her fingers against his skin sent electricity through him that had nothing to do with alien biology and everything to do with basic attraction. Stephen knew he was crossing lines: diplomatic, professional, perhaps even ethical. But in that moment, with her violet eyes gazing up at him with genuine desire, those concerns seemed distant and unimportant. "Ksyla," he said softly, her name a question and permission sought one. Her answer came not in words, but in action as she closed the remaining distance between them. Hours later, as the station's environmental systems cleared the last traces of Jovian spores, Stephen and Ksyla lay entwined on the conference room's emergency cot. The formal furniture had been pushed aside, creating a small sanctuary in the center of the room. "The alarm hasn't sounded again," Stephen observed, his fingers tracing patterns along the luminescent curve of Ksyla's shoulder. She laughed softly against his chest. "Your exposure Therapy appears effective, Commander Stephen, he reminded her, pressing his lips to her forehead. Stephen, she repeated, savoring the intimacy of his name, though. I should probably revert to formality. Once that door unlocks the reality of their situation, hum over them, the approaching royal guard, her father's expectations, their respective duties to their peoples, what had transpired between them during their confinement, had been transformative boundaries of species, dissolving in the discovery of profound compatibility. Their joining had been both alien and familiar, different physiologies, finding unexpected harmony where emerald and mating was typically chemical-driven, and efficient human intimacy, with its gradual exploration, had revealed new dimensions of pleasure to Ksyla, and for Stephen the subtle glow of her skin during moments of passion had created an experience unlike any human encounter. We have approximately 10 hours before Captain Vorks arrives, Seas said reluctantly, sitting up. I need a strategy to prevent my father from sabotaging these negotiations. Your father's primary concern is your safety, correct? Stephen asked, military mind analyzing options. Ostensibly, she replied with a wry smile. Though control would be more accurate, the immorality and royal line has maintained power through biological dominance for millennia. A species immune to that power represents a fun-al threat to his worldview, and a daughter attracted to such a species, Ksyla's violet eyes, met his directly, would be seen as compromised, at best traitorous. At worst, there's one option we haven't discussed, Stephen said after a moment, a formal diplomatic alliance that would make your removal from the station a direct violation of interspecies law. Marriage, she stated, understanding immediately, or whatever the emerald and equivalent would be. Is that so different from arranged royal marriages? Throughout your history, he countered when she raised her eyebrows. No, she admitted. Though those typically involve extensive genetic compatibility testing, we've established our compatibility rather thoroughly, Stephen replied, with a slight smirk that made her emerald skin darken with what he now recognized as an emerald and blush. Indeed, she acknowledged, but my father would never approve. He doesn't need to, Stephen pointed out, under Galactic Covenant law. Royal have the right to form diplomatic unions without sovereign approval. You've researched this, she observed, impressed. I may have reviewed certain protocols while preparing for this mission, he admitted. The point is, a formal union would provide legal protection that even your father would hesitate to violate. The station's announcement system chimed attention. All personnel, Bazard containment protocol has been lifted, all sections returning to normal operations. They looked at the reality of their situation, rushing back. We should dress, Ksyla said. Practically, though reluctance coloured her tone as they restored their appearance in the room to proper order. Stephen outlined his plan. We'll need to file the alliance paperwork immediately. By the time Captain Vorks arrives, it will be a legal fact. And then Ksyla asked, adjusting her formal attire. Then we face in together, Stephen replied simply, as representatives of a new kind of interspecies cooperation. 3 hours later, they stood side by side in the station's reception hall. Their diplomatic union had been filed, witnessed by representatives from 7 species, and transmitted to Earth's government in the Emelian hegemony. Admiral Jensen had initially exploded with accusations of compromised judgment before recognizing the strategic advantage. Emperor Dean's response had been cold silence, more concerning than outright rage. He's here, some murmured as the docking bay doors opened to reveal Emerald and guards, led by a tall figure whose features were set in a permanent scowl. Captain Vorks strode directly toward them, ignoring protocol, his violet eyes fixed on Stephen with undisguised contempt. Princess, he addressed Ksyla without looking at her. Your father has ordered your immediate return, Captain, she replied with perfect composure. As you must be aware, my status has changed. May I present Commander Stephen Clark, my diplomatic consort, under Galactic Covenant Statute 37. This changes nothing, Vorks snarled. The Emperor's orders no longer apply in this matter. Stephen interrupted, his military bearing matching the captain's aggression. Under Covenant law, Princess Ksyla's diplomatic status is now linked to Earth's protection. Vor's hand moved to his weapon. You dare interrupt? Captain Ksyla's voice cut through the tension. Before you consider any action that might constitute an interspecies incident, perhaps you should consult with my father directly. With visible restraint, Forex activated his communication device and stepped aside. When he returned, his expression had shifted from rage to cold calculation. The Emperor wishes to speak with both of you. Emperor Day's imposing visage filled the screen, deliberately ignoring Stephen. Daughter, explain yourself. Father, I have formed a diplomatic alliance that will strengthen our position while securing favorable trade terms with Earth. You have made it with a species immune to our primary evolutionary advantage. The Emperor corrected harshly. No, Father, she countered. I have expanded our understanding of interspecies relations. Human immunity isn't a threat, it's an opportunity. An opportunity, he repeated skeptically. Yes, Stephen interjected. Your Majesty, humans value genuine connection over chemical compliance. Our immunity allows alliances based on mutual respect rather than biological manipulation. A tense silence followed before the Emperor addressed his daughter again. You truly believe this serves our interests? I do so. Affirm. The agreement we've negotiated is 177% more favorable than our initial position, and your personal involvement with this human is both diplomatically advantageous and personally fulfilling. She replied for the first time. Father, I am seen from myself, not from my pheromones or title. Something shifted in the Emperor's expression, a momentary answer softening. I remember your mother saying something similar before the genetic enhancements strengthen our line. This glimpse of personal history surprised both of them. You never told me that. Killa said softly. Captain Vorex, the Emperor commanded your mission. Param have changed. You will remain as the royal escort for Princess Ksyla and her consort, ensure their security, and assist with finalizing the trade agreements. With a regal nod, he ended the transmission. When they were finally alone, Stephen turned to Ksyla. That went better than expected. My father recognizes the strategic value of our union, even if he doesn't approve of the personal aspects, and Captain Vorex will hate you until his dying day, but follow orders perfectly. She replied with a wry smile. Stephen drew her into his arms. So, Princess, it seems we successfully navigated our first crisis as a diplomatic couple, the first of many. I suspect, she replied, her violet eyes sparkling with both challenge and affection. Human emerald and relations will never be the same as they embraced. Kay marveled at the irony. She had come to demonstrate her power over a human only to discover that his immunity would become her greatest freedom. For the first time, she was with someone who wanted her for herself alone, not influenced by biology or royal status. And Stephen found himself grateful for the quirk of human physiology that had made him immune to her chemical influence, allowing them to discover something far more powerful, a connection based on choice rather than compulsion. In the end, her hypnotic pheromones had failed to work on exactly one human male, and that singular exception had changed everything.